Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, July 23rd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. It used to be comical, but suddenly it's not anymore. In the past, blind hatred towards China could have been attributed to ignorance, or at least to indoctrination by the Western propaganda and mass media outlets. But now, China's tremendous leap forward, its excellent humane social policies, and determined people-oriented scientific research, as well as its march towards a so-called ecological civilization, are well documented, to the point that if anyone really wants to know, he or she has plenty of opportunities to learn the truth. But it appears that very few want to learn, at least very few in the West. China is seen negatively in almost all Western countries and their satellites. More surveys in places like Africa, where China intensively interacts with the people, helping them to break the chains of dependency on their neo-colonialist masters from Europe and North America, clearly indicate that it is admired and liked. Last year, 2018, a survey by the influential Pew Research Center established that China is viewed most positively in non-Western countries. 67% in Kenya, where China is involved in substantial infrastructural and social projects. 61% in the most populous African nation, Nigeria. 70% in the Arab country of Tunisia. 53% in the Philippines, despite the fact that there the West has been fueling a dispute over the islands in the South China Sea, and 65% in Russia, which is now the closest Chinese ally. In the UK, 49% of citizens see China positively, 48% in Australia, but only 39% in Germany and 38% in the United States. But what is truly shocking is the attitude of the West towards the leadership of China's president, Xi Jinping, a determined thinker who's leading China towards socialism with Chinese characteristics. Almost eliminating extreme poverty, by the year 2020, there should be no pockets of misery left anywhere in the territory of the PRC, and who's putting culture, a high quality of life, ecology, and the general well-being of the Chinese people above economic indicators. Conservative anti-communist Poland leads the pack. Only 9% of Poles have confidence in the leadership of President Xi, 11% of Greeks, 14% of Italians, 15% of Spaniards. That says something about Europe, as even in Canada the number is 42%, and in the United States 39%. Is it truly just ignorance? When interviewed by various Chinese media outlets, I'm often asked the same question. Why are we constantly criticized in the West while we try to play by the rules in doing our best to improve the planet? The answer is obvious, precisely for that reason. Some 20 years ago, China and its socialist project were still in the unfinished stage. There were big differences in standards of living between the urban areas in the east and the countryside. Transportation was inadequate. Pollution in the industrial cities was very, very bad. Tens of millions of people were trying to migrate from the countryside to the cities in search of jobs and a better living, putting great strains on the social system of the nation. Those who did not like China had plenty of ammunition when criticizing it then. The country was moving forward, but the task to make it prosperous, clean, and healthy appeared to be Sisyphean. What followed was an absolute miracle. unprecedented in human history. Only the Soviet Union before World War II registered greater growth and improvement of the standards of living of its people than China did in the last 2 decades. Everything in China changed. Its cities became clean, green, ecological, full of public parks, exercise machines for adults and children. Urban centers are now overflowing with a first-class public transportation, all ecological, with impressive museums, concert halls, excellent universities, and medical centers. Subsidized super high trains are connecting all major cities of the country. In Communist China, everything is planned by the government and by the Communist Party, and the private sector is there to serve the nation, not vice versa. It works. It works remarkably well. Citizens have much more say about how their country is governed than those in the West. Cities are clean, efficient, built for the people, no beggars and no slums, no misery. Things are getting better and better. Foreigners who come to China for the first time are shocked. China looks much wealthier than the U.S. or U.K. Its streets, its airports, its metro systems, high-speed trains, theaters, sidewalks, parks easily put those in New York or Paris to shame. But it's not rich. Far from it. China's GDP per capita is still relatively low. But that is precisely what makes socialism with Chinese characteristics so impressive and superior to the Western capitalism fueled by imperialism. China does not need to have average incomes of some $50,000 per capita to prosper, to give its people an increasingly great life, to protect the environment, and promote great culture. Could it be that this is precisely why the West is shaking in fear? The West, where economic growth is everything, where people live in constant fear instead of optimistic hope for the future. The West, where trillions of dollars and euros are wasted annually so the elites can live in bizarre luxury and preside over irrational, unnecessary overproduction and arms accumulation, which bring no well-being to the majority. China and its central planning are offering a much better and logical system for its citizens and for the world. Most of its science is geared to the improvement of life on this planet, not for cold profits. President Xi's brainchild, BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is designed to lift up billions of people worldwide out of poverty and to connect the world instead of fragmenting it. So why is President Xi so much disliked in Europe? Could it be that it's precisely because of the gigantic success of China? Back to the previous point. 20 years ago, China had enormous social and environmental problems. The Westerners who did not like the Communist Party of any type would come and point fingers at things. Quote, "You see, Shanghai and Shenzhen are now prosperous, but look at other cities on the coast. See the contrast?" Then the cities on the coast all began improving, planning parks, universities, metros, beautiful streets. Criticism from the West continued. Quote, "Now leave the coast, go west, and you will see how unequal China is." Close quote. Eventually, the west of China improved so much that there was virtually no difference between the quality of life in the cities there and on the coast. "It's all so cynical," the rant went on. "The difference between the cities and the countryside is so huge that peasants are forced to abandon their villages and seek jobs in the big cities." Close quote. Under the leadership of President Xi, the entire countryside received an enormous overhaul. Transportation, medical services, educational facilities, and job availability improved so much that in 2018, for the first time in modern history, people began migrating back from the cities to the countryside. Now what? What next? Human rights? Not much to trash anymore if one sees with eyes open. But the better China becomes, the more it cares about its people, as well as people all over the world, the harder it gets attacked. Not one wow from Western regime and its mainstream media. Not one China is now a leader of the world in ecology, social policies, science, and virtually everything public. Why? The answer is obvious and unfortunately depressing. It's because the West does not want China and its president to succeed. Or if he succeeds, it has to be hushed. The two systems are so different that if China's one is correct, the Western one is wrong. And the West is not searching for a concept that is good for the world. It only wants its own concept to survive and dominate the planet. Full stop. That is why China is so popular in the countries which want to save their people from misery and to build new and better societies. That is why China is smeared and disliked, even hated, in the West and in a handful of countries outside the West, where Westerners and their descendants are both ruling and controlling the mass media. Argentina, for example. On a positive note, despite the determined and vicious propaganda being spread by Western and West-controlled mass media outlets, many more people have confidence in President Xi than in the U.S. President, Donald Trump, who inspires only 27% of the people all over the world. This article is from New Eastern Outlook and written by Andrei Vilcek, a philosopher, novelist, filmmaker, and investigative journalist. He's covered wars and conflicts in dozens of countries. One of his latest books is Dialogue with Noam Chomsky on Western Terrorism. Vilcek presently resides in East Asia and the Middle East and continues to work around the world. He can be reached through his website and his Twitter, and this article will be on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air if you wish to follow it up. You're watching Aware on the Air. And we're trying to remember the year 1991, the year Christopher Lasch, whom I'm happy to say that I knew, wrote The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics. It can be like trying to conjure a foreign country to remember that year. Back then, there were no tablets or e-books or smartphones. There was no Facebook and no Amazon and no Twitter and no Google. Only a handful of geeks and government agents had even heard the word Internet. In 1991, the revolution that had Americans talking wasn't digital, it was Russian, with the last days of the Cold War passing more in whimpers than bangs, as an attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev destabilized and eventually dissolved the Soviet Union. There was a war in Iraq, but it was quick and decisive. There were wars against terrorists being fought around the globe, but there was no war on terror. And there was nobody in the United States who seemed particularly concerned about the possibility of mass murderous attacks on American soil. This is 10 years before 9/11, 1991 we're talking about. It was a time before so many contemporary cultural touchstones. Not only before 9/11, but before Columbine, before Oklahoma City, before Harry Potter, before Lewinsky, before O.J., before Lawrence v. Texas, before Citizens United, before Bush v. Gore, before Obama, before the Euro, before Y2K, and before Viagra. Now think of all the distance that seems to separate then and now, all the change that marks the last quarter century. That's why to read The True and Only Heaven today is to appreciate Christopher Lasch's genius in a way no one could have appreciated it in 1991. Although written then, the book cuts to the heart of now. Today it's clear what could not have been as clear 25 years ago. Christopher Lasch saw beneath the superficial ebbs and flows of American history and politics to the more enduring and decisive currents beneath. Before anything else, then, reading The True and Only Heaven teaches you two things. First, despite what anyone might tell you, and despite how things might seem, the defining features of American politics have not changed much in the past 25 years. And second, Christopher Lasch is a prophet of our time. Consider merely what Lasch calls the underlying premise of his book, The True and Only Heaven. Quote, that old political ideologies have exhausted their capacity either to explain events or to inspire men and women to constructive actions, leading the characteristic mood of the times to be a baffled sense of drift. Close quote. That's Lasch in 1991. It's hard to think of a better way to capture the dynamics of the 2016 presidential campaign, isn't it? That campaign season might best be explained as the product of a nationwide bafflement with a political system that seems to have drifted away from the central concerns of many people's lives. After all, despite our disagreements on all sorts of policy issues, Americans share the conviction that something is missing in our political practice. In the most recent American National Election Studies survey, only 19% of Americans agreed with the idea that the government is, quote, run for the benefit of all the people, close quote, 19%. Across the political spectrum, one hears the refrain that Democrats and Republicans are indistinguishable, self-interested, detached from reality, beholden to special interests, and so on. And in fact, in 2016, if you type the words Democrats and Republicans, or Republicans and Democrats, into Google, the algorithms predict your next words will be, are the same. That year, the surprisingly successful campaigns of Senator Bernie Sanders and Donald J. Trump both have traded on the idea that some strange affliction is upon the nation and is largely embodied in an out-of-touch political establishment. As such, the United States needs a revolution or someone to make America great again. We've drifted, and indeed radical government action to set us straight, though in both cases, particularly Trump's, there's more than a little lack of clarity about what the terms of that straightening would entail. To that extent, it's fair to say that Lasch, who died in 1994, would not have been surprised by the tenor of either the Sanders or the Trump candidacy. In fact, he explicitly imagined that there would arise in the United States vaguely oppositional movements that looked to some like socialism on the left and to others like fascism on the right, though Lasch thought it ought to be clear by now that neither fascism nor socialism represents the wave of the future. He would have seen Sanders and Trump, then, as additional symptoms of an underlying problem as opposed to that problem's solution. For Lasch, the great underlying problem was clear enough, that by the end of the 20th century, the American left and right had, quote, come to share so many of the same underlying convictions, including a belief in the desirability and inevitability of technical and economic development, that the conflict between them, shrill and acrimonious as it is, no longer speaks to the central issues of American politics. Close quote. That is, by the end of the 20th century, the dominant figures in American politics had all become uncritical believers in and proponents of the idea of progress. By the idea of progress, Lasch had in mind the faith that we humans can continually improve our lot and standards of living, that we should seek to satisfy all our increasing desires without any consideration of natural limits or moral restraints. The underlying creed is that progress will lead us to the promised land, to the, quote, true and only heaven, a phrase borrowed from Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose story, The Celestial Railroad, prefigures many of Lasch's themes. I'll post that story, too, on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Among contemporary American left-wingers, so many of whom, indeed, like to call themselves progressives, the commitment to ideas of progress manifests itself in technological optimism, cultural cosmopolitanism, and various doctrines of personal liberation. Those on the right, meanwhile, share the technological optimism of the left, but add to it a program of market deregulation and a vision of unending economic growth. Lasch laments that even by 1991, The conservative voices that were the last bulwarks of skepticism about progress in mainstream politics had been largely co-opted, marginalized, and heeded only in occasional right-wing lip service to, quote, traditional values, close quote. Democrats and Republicans alike speak the languages of individualism and globalism, promising ever-expanding choices on an ever-expanding scale. No one of any prominence seems to be asking whether the visions attached to those promises are realistic, much less desirable. Sanders and Trump are again good cases in point. Though each got traction for criticizing certain excesses of the political establishment, drawing attention to the costs of free trade agreements, for example, or lamenting the lack of restraints on the financial industry, neither candidate questioned the underlying progressive ethos of that establishment. In fact, Sanders and Trump are themselves both fundamentally progressive candidates. They both made grand and optimistic promises that imagined ever rosier futures. Neither of them asked voters to consider a return to more modest standards of living or to more restrained political ambitions. Sanders, of course, was a self-declared progressive. Trump, meanwhile, is summed up by one biographer as someone for whom there is, quote, never enough, close quote. Today, even the political position we think of as outlying tend to lie well within a progressive creed. Lash suggests there are two problems with all this elite genuflection at the altar of progress. First, it both demeans and is disconnected from the values of most Americans, who understand that you can't have everything, who know that everything costs something, who want stable and satisfying lives for their children, who have been on the losing end of enough programs of improvement to be skeptical about the dogma of progress. This is not an exclusively American phenomenon, to be sure. As I write this article, British voters have just elected to remove their country from the European Union, Brexit. In response, the president of the EU, the European Union, admitted that ordinary people were frustrated with a progressive, technocratic, cosmopolitan elite. Quote, disillusioned with great visions of the future, he mused, they demand that we cope with the present reality better than we have been doing. Close quote. Lash's own story resonates here. He was a child of middle America who, upon having children of his own, realized both the pervasiveness and the peril of the cult of progress in the United States. That's because he realized that his children were growing up in a country that was essentially hostile to their flourishing, as evidenced by our obsession with sex, violence, and the pornography of making it, our addictive dependence on drugs, entertainment, and the evening news, our impatience with anything that limits our sovereign freedom of choice, especially with the constraints of marital and familial ties, our preference for non-binding commitments, our third-rate educational system, our third-rate morality, our refusal to draw a distinction between right and wrong, lest we impose our morality on others, and thus invite others to impose their morality on us. Our reluctance to judge and be judged, our indifference to future generations, as evidenced by our willingness to saddle them with a huge national debt, an overgrown arsenal of destruction, and a deteriorating environment, our inhospitable attitude to the newcomers born into our midst, our unstated assumption which underlies so much of the propaganda for unlimited abortion, that only those children born for success ought to be allowed to be born at all. On top of all that, and maybe even more than all that, Lash realized that his children were growing up in a society where naked ambition and the willingness to get ahead at all costs count more than honest, devoted, productive work. Lash found clear words to articulate the anxious questions that, felt but left unsaid, gnawed so many hearts. The society may be all about progress, but progress toward what? And progress for whom? Lasch raises the second major critique of the American cult of progress right at the beginning of his book, The True and Only Heaven. Quote, "How does it happen that serious people continue to believe in progress," he asks, "in the face of massive evidence that might have been expected to refute the idea of progress once and for all?" Close quote. After the modern-minded atrocities of the 20th century, in the face of the collapse of the middle class and a widening gap between rich and poor, which he predicted would generate more and more violent movements of insurrection and terrorism against the West, and looking forward to the deterioration of the planet's climate and resources, it seems more than foolish to put all one's money in the bank of progress. We're at a moment when the exhaustion of the progressive tradition is evident, but nobody seems to have an alternative to it. To Lasch, it seemed pretty clear that what has gotten us to this point, to the draining dominance of the cult of progress, is the draining dominance of the cult of progress in America. He first traces the origins of that cult back to the 18th century, when the founders of modern liberalism first argued that because human beings are creatures of insatiable desire, there needed to be a continual increase in productive capacities to satisfy those desires. Modern liberalism and progressivism go hand in hand. It's hard to imagine the former existing without the latter. It's a convincing argument, although not an altogether new one. Plenty of other scholars made the case before Lasch did, and plenty have made it after him. What makes Lasch's contribution in The True and Only Heaven distinctive is that he adds to that analysis the claim that there's been long and vigorous opposition to progressive ideology in the United States, but the history of that opposition, what Lasch calls the populist tradition, has been ignored, obscured, and misunderstood. As a result, we've lost touch with what is our most serious intellectual resource for the interrogation of American progressivism and our best source of moral inspiration for developing an alternative to it in the 21st century. Lots of folks have talked about populism, to be sure, but Lasch treats American populism with a sympathy and sophistication distinctively his own. By Lasch's account, what unites the populist tradition is an appreciation for the idea of limits, as opposed to limitless expansion, an admiration for small-scale proprietorship, as opposed to widespread consumerism, a cultivation of the pursuit of useful callings, as opposed to luxury and worldly success, a commitment to self-governance, as opposed to rule by technocratic experts, and a sensibility of guarded hope, as opposed to blind optimism. In Marx's terms, populists embody the sensibility of the petty bourgeois, with its emphasis on loyalty, hard work, and self-discipline. American populists tend to be suspicious of innovation, and in that sense track as conservative. But because, as Lasch teaches, resistance to innovation is, quote, an indispensable ingredient in revolutionary action, they also tend to track as radicals. One of the things Lasch reminds us again and again is that in a progressive society, the most radical position is a conservative one. They thus fall outside the categories conservative radical, Republican Democrat, red state, blue state, popular intellectual, into which Americans are used to dividing ourselves. Lasch largely devotes The True and Only Heaven to bringing that populist tradition back to the surface of American thought. In his ranging historical tour de force, it's almost as if he were writing an entirely new canon, if not altogether a new American history. He brushes the dust off of neglected figures like Randolph Bourne, Orestes Brownson, G.D.H. Cole, Josiah Royce, and Georges Sorel that makes them central to the story of American political thought. He shows that they, along with others, have been snubbed in most historical accounts precisely because their thinking did not fall neatly into our predetermined boxes. His project thus evokes one of the great paradoxes of human life, that people who defy easy intellectual categorization, people truly outside the dominant categories of our times, are the ones most likely to be sources of intellectual energy and moral vision. moral vision. But they're also those at the greatest risk of being ignored simply because others find them confusing. Socrates was lucky to get the kind of attention in Athens that he did. History suggests that most people who travel outside the common paths are rendered invisible by neglect rather than engaged by condemnation. Lasch also rereads standard-bearing American thinkers like Jonathan Edwards, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Martin Luther King Jr. in ways that showcase their populist and anti-progressive dimensions. He argues that the populist dimensions of those thinkers have been lost or misunderstood, not only for the reason just outlined, but also because we too often make the mistake of expecting people in elite positions to be on the side of the elite. It makes more intuitive sense to most of us to put a Harvard man like Emerson on the side of the cosmopolitan intellectuals and radical individualists, rather than to see him on the side of the provincial farmers and as someone who revered the fact of human interdependence. To be clear, Lasch doesn't suggest at any point that the populist tradition is the solution to all progressivism's problems. The populist tradition asks the right questions, he says, but it does not provide a ready-made set of answers. He acknowledges the often dangerous provincialism and nativism and anti-intellectualism that have often accompanied populist thought, though he faults liberals in particular for being so eager to distance themselves from those sins that they've lost sight of what is valuable in petty bourgeois, lower-middle-class culture. I think Lasch might have been heartened by a recent op-ed in the Washington Post in which the left-leaning author asked, "Is it possible to have populism without racism?" and decided the answer was yes, albeit provisionally so. More foundationally, though, Lasch notes the greatest weakness of the populist tradition is that it's provided so little in the way of a formal economic and political theory that it does not offer ready guidance to those who would like to realize its ideals in practice. These days, that means that those who can be said to be the inheritors of America's populist tradition, people like Wendell Berry, Rod Dreher, Jeff Taylor, among other current writers, call for small-scale production and political decentralization, but they do not explain how these objectives can be achieved in a modern economy. Lasch leaves the true and only heaven with this problem hanging in the air. I suppose that especially for those who already have a populist bent, it may be a frustrating denouement. I think most populist-leaning thinkers today are already aware of the difficulty that attends bringing the populist tradition into the 21st century. When I assign a populist author to my students, most of them, sympathetic to populist ideas or not, jump to the critique right away. It sounds nice, they say, but that's just not how the world is anymore. Or, how is anything like that supposed to happen today? The question of to what degree, if any, it's possible to realize a populist vision in a modern technological, large-scale, impersonal, bureaucratic world is quite evidently the great question with which all would-be populists need to wrestle. We've been considering the tract The True and Only Heaven by Christopher Lasch, a discussion of the burgeoning political movement, not only in America and around the world, that our present pundits want to ignore, and that is populism. We'll conclude today with an interview by Chris Hedges with Carrie Ann Mendoza, the editor-in-chief of The Canary, a news website in Britain, which has just come up with a remarkable new prime minister. Mendoza describes The Canary as an alternative publication which aims to get socialism back on the agenda. Socialism, a perfectly legitimate alternative idea that addresses some of the critical issues that are facing our society today, which are born of a morally and literally bankrupt political ideology, neoliberalism. Our entire media backs that model. Close quote. You've been watching Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook gmail.com. We rely on our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog Digital Citizen we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes to this program. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.